All right, bit of a different type of video today. I really wanted to talk about the influence of PRI, or otherwise known as Postural Restoration Institute, and its impact on the way I view human movement, and then some of the potential application for strength training. So some of you will know exactly what I mean when I talk about PRI or Postural Restoration Institute, especially if you're spending a lot of time on social media consuming strength training content, especially between sort of 2020 and 2022. There was a big PRI for strength training bubble, which has definitely burst since then, and that's why I wanted to sort of track back and take a second look at and just try to explain to people with a little bit more context what I found useful about some of the PRI concepts and their application to strength training or just human movement in general. And look, even myself, I'm not a real big PRI Kool-Aid drinker, but I also want to be open and honest about where all my ideas that I apply to strength training came from. And at the end of the day, as much as I could have been exposed to these ideas from a few different places, PRI was where I picked them up from. So just being honest about that. Anyway, so for people who don't know, I'm just going to read it off the PRI website, how they describe themselves. Like, essentially it is a rehab system, but again, obviously, you know, training and rehab, they sort of overlap. So anyway, here's how they describe themselves. So on their website, they say, Postural Restoration Institute was established in 2000 to explore and explain the science of postural adaptations, asymmetrical patterns, and the influence of polyarticular chains of muscles. Our mission is based on the development of innovative treatment that addresses the primary contributions of postural kinematic movement dysfunction. And a few of you are probably already thinking like, wait, these guys sound obsessed with posture, like they could be fragilistas, like they have very biological explanations of pain, or they think that posture is a big influence on dysfunctional pain. Why the hell is Angus jiving with these guys? Other than the fact that there's some useful concepts in PRI that can be applied to strength training, I guess the other purpose of this discussion is I want to highlight how like pretty much every system, especially all these fitness systems or different models that have an acronym associated with them, you can take issue with all of them. Like they all suck in their own way, but there's probably some seeds of value in all of them. I mean, I'm going to try to not shit on PRI too much today. I'm just going to talk about, again, what I sort of found valuable that I learned from PRI and applied to strength training. I think the other thing to bear in mind is, you know, so many people looked at PRI and took it at face value and like, what the hell can I learn from a rehab system where they're obsessed with posture and laying on your back and breathing into balloons? How the hell can we apply those concepts productively to strength training? But it's just about, you know, taking it with a teaspoon of salt. Like if you just consume all the PRI content and take it at face value, there's probably no benefit to your strength training. But, I mean, let me just get into it. Actually, it's not just posture that they're obsessed with and like asymmetries and things like that at PRI. They push this idea that breathing and locomotion or breathing and gait are very foundational and underpinning concepts of human movement. And I would say that's probably like the common thread between me and PRI. Like I also like this sort of lens of breathing and gait as a way to make sense of human movement, try to figure out what's going on. Outside of paying a bit more attention to the breath cycle and understanding the gait cycle, I'd say that the other big thing that PRI illuminated for me was just paying a bit of attention to the rib cage. In the strength training world, no one had ever mentioned the rib cage. It was just sort of, you know, everyone was like hips, spine, shoulders. But PRI, they're very big on focusing on the rib cage, talking about the way it moves or maybe the way it doesn't move in some people, and then how that can affect the rest of the system as well. So probably one of the initial concepts for me that I found most illuminating from PRI was just this idea that pronation and medial knee travel wasn't the end of the world, especially when you're trying to produce force. So like no one in the strength training world could explain to me why pronation of the foot or knees moving together. I mean, it was always viewed as a bad thing in the strength training world. You know, everyone was sort of talking about if you want to produce a lot of force in a squat, you've got to root your foot into the ground. You've got to twist everything outwards. You want to have a really big arch in your foot. If that collapses, that's bad. That's an energy leakage. And if your knees move in towards your body, that's horrible. It means your glutes are switching off and all this other nonsense. Whereas all of a sudden in PRI land, even though they didn't seem to give a shit or even like the idea of heavy lifting, they're like, oh no, if you're producing a lot of force or if you're pushing as hard as you can, you're gonna pronate your foot, so you're gonna flatten that arch and your knees are gonna move in towards your midline. Because their view of things is that's just how we produce force. I mean, you see it in the gait cycle, in mid-stance when we're in the most propulsive phase of gait, pushing along the ground. That's when we see all the pronation and the lower limb moves inwards towards the midline. So it makes sense to them that when we're under a really heavy load, trying to push into the ground as hard as possible with the barbell, probably going to pronate and see even more medial knee travel in that context. And again, like as a movement optimist, which like PRI definitely doesn't align with movement optimism in any sort of way, but and that's it. Like you can sort of arrive at this, like either not giving a shit about pronation on your heavier lifts or anything like that. And I'd say that's like a movement optimist view of it. But it was sort of interesting to sort of see this PRI camp where they're like, no, we're not saying that it's okay to pronate and for your knees to come in on heavy lifts. We love it. Sorry, they weren't saying that either because they'd never tell you to lift heavy, but that's sort of what I took from it. Whoopsie. And it worked out. And yeah, so that was sort of the first moment, just this idea of embracing pronation, embracing a little bit of medial knee travel in the hardest part of a squat. It actually helps you produce force. That was the seed for me to start looking at PRI and thinking to myself, these nerds, they might know a thing or two about heavy lifting, or not even that, but they might, I might be able to apply some of their concepts to heavy lifting or strength training. Actually, if you want to see a great article written about this topic, go check out Google Knees In for the Win. Pat Davidson. Pat Davidson is also a really good strength coach who I admire a lot, who has also applied a lot of PRI concepts to strength training. Okay, so other than being a bit obsessed with the rib cage and posture, the other thing that PRI really drew my attention to was just this huge sensory motor or proprioceptive component to human movement, or how we can improve that in people and how we can really scale it. And again, once I explain these concepts, it might sort of seem obvious how we could have used these to help scale movement for people without sort of being introduced to it through PRI, but none of that was really obvious to me, again, until I looked into PRI a little bit. So, credit where it's due. Like I said, I'm just trying to explain where I picked up these tools from and be honest about it. Okay, so when it comes to the sensory motor side of things, it is a very deep rabbit hole that you can go down through PRI. They will take you there, talking about mouth guards, molar occlusion, how your glasses and things like that can affect the way that you move or perceive yourself in space. But the sensory motor component of PRI that I think is really applicable to strength training is just this idea of putting someone down on the ground. So in the strength training world, when we're trying to regress someone, the stereotype is regress to the bar. I mean, that's a bit of a meme in and of itself. Not everyone needs to be regressed all the way to the bar, but just this idea that if you're trying to regress a movement as much as possible, it's just about removing all the load or as much load as possible. But you can actually go so much further than that. So I think PRI, they have a pretty decent framework for not just scaling the loads, affecting the human system at any given point, but then also really scaling a proprioceptive environment. So in strength training land, people often talk about this idea of regressing someone to the bar. That's as much as we can regress a movement, it's just sort of taking load off the person. But what PRI people would talk about is like, no, you've still got load on the system. You've got gravity affecting us. And so for a lot of people, they're what we call a slave to gravity. They just don't have many movement options, or maybe they don't have that good of proprioception, and they will just get pushed into all sorts of positions because that's just their body's most efficient way of resisting gravity and holding them upright. Like some people have pretty unique strategies to do that aren't necessarily conducive to other movements that we want to introduce them to. And honestly, this next tip has been such a problem solver and a legitimate game changer for me when it comes to coaching clients into positions where like the verbal cues just aren't doing it. I think we've all run into that problem with our clients at some point. So in PRI land, if you wanted to change the way someone was squatting hypothetically, not only would you take all the load off the bar, but you would try to remove the load of gravity as much as possible as well. So you just like lay someone down on their back. And even further to that, you might, if you're familiar with PRI, you would have seen them put people into this position, but then they've got their feet pressed into the wall as well. So then we've got contact for our whole rib cage, our head, our spine, our shoulders and hips, and you'll even have foot contacts on the wall as well. I mean, there's so many times where we want our clients to get into a different position or something like that, and that they're trying to do their best to follow our instructions, but they're just not doing it. A big reason for that is so many people just have no idea where they are in space. So they think they're doing what you're telling them to do, but like I said, they didn't even know where their starting point was. So how could they even judge relatively then what position they're moving into? All of a sudden, if you lay someone on their back, like if I'm in this like open scissor position, which some people just have no idea that they're in this position when they're lifting, I can tell immediately because, again, I can just feel so much pressure on my hips, so much pressure on the back of my skull and shoulders, but then nothing on this lower part of my rib cage, lower back can't feel the ground at all. So again, it's a really easy environment to coach someone through where they can tell exactly where they are in space, okay? I can tell when my spine is nice and flat or closer to neutral. I can tell when my spine is extended. I can tell what part of my foot that I'm pushing through. And it's also really easy for me to control that because, again, I don't have to worry about falling over because I'm already on the ground. So yeah, the real takeaway there is if you really want to regress a movement, it's not just about taking the literal weight off the bar, but you can even lay someone down on the ground and then you've taken most of the effects of gravity off the system as well. And then also just understanding that the ground is such a phenomenal proprioceptive tool because there's just more things touching our body. And this is something that we don't even have to let go of as we get more upright and as we start to add load to our movements. Now or hopefully you're already starting to think about how things like a pendulum squat or a hack squat, they almost give us this similar effect as well, where we can still get a really good training effect, but we've got a really good proprioceptive environment to understand what sort of shapes we're making with our hips, rib cage, spine, shoulders, etc. Or maybe just put even more simply, if your clients aren't following your instructions, give them things to touch and then they'll know exactly where they are in space. So one of the other main reasons they love slapping people down on the ground in PRI land is it helps people get into this position called the stack. The stack's honestly, it's like the PRI term for neutral, I guess, but I think it's a really, really useful position to help people with squatting and hinging movements and even getting their arms above their head a lot of the time. So for some reason in strength training land, when a lot of people think about a neutral spine, they sort of just think about a really, really straight spine. The PRI view of neutral, or the stack, is we've got a pelvic floor, and then you've got a thoracic diaphragm stacked directly over top of that, and then you've got a skull stacked directly over the top of that. This would be, we're sort of using our imaginary X-ray vision here. If you could see my pelvic floor, so yeah, just sort of thinking about pelvic floor, thoracic diaphragm, and then having your skull above that. Oh, I don't know, my head's probably forward, got that text neck. But yeah, skull, thoracic diaphragm, pelvic floor. And when you're in that position, that's sort of when the natural neutral curves of the spine come out. So again, PRI, I think they've got a much more, like whether you care about neutral posture or not is a whole nother thing, but PRI really emphasize that a neutral spine, it does have that lordotic curve in the lumbar spine, and it has a kyphotic curve in the thoracic spine, and then back into a lordotic curve for the neck or the cervical spine. Okay, and so what's so magic about this stacked position? It's not magic, but I'll show you some things that it helped me with. All right, so coming out of strength training lands where everyone was just obsessed with extending your spine, this is good posture for lift and weight. This is just your posture for everything. Extend the shit out of your spine and you can't go wrong. The problem is for a lot of people when they're in this position, that even with heel elevation and anterior loads, a lot of people just really struggle to get full squat depth. Whereas all of a sudden, you get into this stacked position, so you get your hips back under you, you get your rib cage right over that, you make sure your head's not too shoved forward, maybe even you give someone a counterbalance as well, it assists with these things. Then all of a sudden, just dropping straight down into a squat like you're stuck in an elevator shaft. So yeah, I was having an experience where it was really tough to get people to squat deep with this really extended spinal position. But then all of a sudden, when you get people a little bit more stacked or neutral, so again, get their hips under them, get their rib cage stacked over that, try to keep the noggin stacked over that. Again, a bit of a counterbalance is something that facilitates that posture. Boom, all of a sudden you can just sink straight down into a deep squat. It's a really good hinging position. Because again, when you look at that extended position, you're starting with your hips so flexed already. So very common to just like run out of room with squatting or hinging when you're trying to go into deep hip flexion. All of a sudden, not starting in like a literal posterior tilt, but just starting not as anteriorly tilted means that you have so much more space to go down into hip flexion or back into hip flexion in the case of a hip hinge. And it's not even just for the lower limb as well. It has the same effect for the upper limb. One of the biggest pain points as a personal trainer or even powerlifters run into this problem a lot. They have really extended postures, which is maybe good for bench pressing or not moving through too much of a range of motion. But then as soon as they go to get their arms above their head, or let me do it like a powerlifter, they sort of get stuck here. all of a sudden when we're in a little bit more of this stacked position, it's so much easier to get our arms up above our heads. And I think a big reason for that is when we just open up the back of our ribs a little bit and we aren't so extended, if we think about the shape of our shoulder blade, it's sort of like a little bit of a concave shape, and then having a convex shape to our rib cage just provides a little bit nicer of a surface for the shoulder blade to glide over. Or maybe what else is happening is we're creating a little bit more of a fulcrum to stretch our lats over. So when you really extend the shit out of your thoracolumbar junction, it's really, really hard to stretch out your lats to get your arms overhead. You sort of end up just stuck here. Scaps don't really want to move. Lats don't really want to let go. Again, shifting things back a little bit, just getting things neutral. All of a sudden, it's a lot easier for our shoulder blades to move, and we've got a little bit more of a fulcrum to stretch our lats around to get our arms up above our head. So yeah, the stack, really, really interesting position. Or something else about the stack as well, whenever I was trying to get tight and braced for a heavy lift, just tighten my back as much as possible. And I mean, it was pretty effective, but I never felt any tension at the front, and that was always weird for me. I always felt like I was just using my back a lot in movements. I don't mind feeling my back when I'm lifting heavy, but I don't want that to be the only thing that I'm feeling. Whereas getting into a more stacked posture for me, I was able to feel equal tension at the front and the back of me, and it was just overall a more comfortable lifting experience, I would say. And I think I was better able to create pressure. When you're in this open position, sometimes your tummy just keeps expanding and expanding and expanding when you're taking that breath in to get your brace. Whereas all of a sudden when you're not as opened up at the front, it feels like you create pressure without having to take in as much air. So yeah, I felt like I could just drink in volumes and volumes of air and never feel really tight. When I was under a bar, all of a sudden getting a little bit more stacked, a little sip of air, and I was creating so much more pressure and feeling so much more braced. Okay, the other thing that PRI introduced me to was this idea of the hip shift. So this is for all those people, every time I put up a Q&A box, they're like, how do I increase my hip internal rotation? Okay, this is how you do it. So a lot of people, when they're doing their split squats, they're mainly just trying to think about not falling over. So a lot of people will just adopt a stance where they're still hanging out with their center of mass evenly distributed between both their bases of support. And there can be so many different reasons why you're prescribing a split squat, right? I'm not saying that it's wrong to use both of your legs in a split squat. Hell, some people do split squats where they're actually using the back leg as much as possible. So it's however you want to do it, right? But for me, when I'm prescribing split squats, a lot of the time when I'm doing it, it's because I want them to get most of their weight on one leg and just use the other leg minimally for balance. And so hip shifting and learning how to shift in and out of your hips is how we achieve that. So you sort of see that in order to get most of my weight on this front leg, which would be my working leg, I have to turn into that side. And this is a phenomenal way to stretch out the posterior aspect of your hip and a phenomenal way to work on your hip internal rotation, just getting your nose, your sternum, and your knee lined up right over that big toe and then working in that range. So you sort of see, right, a lot of people when they're doing their bilateral work, you've got to externally rotate things to get them out of the way. Whereas then in our split squats, it's this great opportunity to really line ourselves up and work on that more internally rotated position. So hip shifts for me, that was a real game changer. Just going from hanging out between both of my legs when I was doing my split squats versus understanding how I could really shift into that hip. And then really looking at split squats as more of a frontal plane drill. So again, bilateral exercises, a bit better for hip external rotation. And we're challenging ourselves in the sagittal plane stability-wise. Like if we're going to fall over, we're going to fall forwards or backwards. All of a sudden when I'm in that staggered stance, I'm more thinking about shifting into that one side completely. And again, we're just training and strengthening ourselves in a little bit more of an internally rotated position, okay? Bilateral, sagittal plane, ER, unilateral, frontal plane, internal rotation. And as well, remember this internal rotation thing, it goes to a whole new level when you've really drunk that PRI Kool-Aid and you're embracing a bit of pronation, right? Because that all just lines you up and creates all that nice hip internal rotation. So yeah, if you're one of the thousands of people who's always like, Angus, how do I improve my hip internal rotation? Just nail some split squats or any sort of staggered stance work where you actually get all your weight into one leg and you just line yourself up. That's going to give you some internal rotation. You can apply this concept to the upper body as well. There's the upper body hip shift, or the shoulder shift, I guess. The same way that lower body bilateral lifts tend to be a little bit more like this, like they rob us of the opportunity to shift in and out of each side. You could say the same thing about your upper body bilateral lifts. Again, they kind of just open us up a little bit more externally rotated. All of a sudden, when we're working one side at a time, we can shift into that side. So this is a really nice upper back stretch. So again, you could do this like in a rowing exercise, right? If I'm here, if I'm bilateral, I'll be a little bit more like this. All of a sudden, if I've just got one arm, I can turn my sternum into that working arm a little bit more. And again, really stretch out that middle upper back, or it's something as well you could introduce into like a unilateral preacher bicep curl. So not just hanging my arm over the bench for support, but I'm also going to turn into that side a little bit. And again, I'm still getting just as good of a bicep pump, but then I can breathe into my back and stretch it out as well. It's a really, really nice lat trap stretch. All right, so I'd say that that's a pretty good summary of the main things that I took from PRI and applied to my strength training. So just a little bit of a summary. You have a rib cage. Everyone in the strength training world kind of ignores it. It's good to just be aware that you have a rib cage and that it's going to affect the way you move. Laying people on the ground is a phenomenal proprioceptive tool, and a lot of people are just so weak and uncoordinated that even just taking all the weight off them, you're not regressing things as far as you could be. Lay people on the ground if they're not behaving the way you want them to. Again, viewing unilateral work as an opportunity to train internal rotation or work in the frontal plane a little bit more deliberately, and just a little bit more of a nuanced view of what a neutral posture is, or a neutral axial skeleton, and how that can help us get into really, really deep squats, really, really nice hinges, and make it a little bit easier for you to get your arms up above your head. If you want to learn a little bit more about how we apply strength training here at General Physical Preparation, check out all the courses, check out all the free programs down below. If you want to apply for coaching, got a few spaces on the roster as well, so fill out the form, and I'll see you in a few days with another video.